Yeah, the concert. Okay. All right. Well, do you have a handout? You have a handout. Yes, you do. And, you know, it's, I'm the one who's blessed, and I hope you're blessed too. And the only way for that to be possible is for you to be present. Because as I prepare the message, I become more present. Everything all right? Am I on? I think I'm on. Everybody hear me? Okay. Okay, all the way on. Yes. Yeah, because it makes me much more present with familiar text. Text that we've all read before, text that we could even recite, or at least paraphrase at times. And what I realize as I'm doing this is that Jesus is talking about what we could call integrity. And so in this message, I'm going to break some things down with definitions because I like words. You know, I was thinking about it last week that when I was a kid and I'd go and get the cows, I would be rhyming words in my head. It's just the way I'm made. I like words, but what I realize is that we often have different understandings or interpretations of what a word means. So I want to make sure that the word that I have in mind is communicated in a way that it says what I want to say and communicates to you what I'm trying to say. So we're talking about integrity here, and I'm going to give you a definition. What's going on? A definition. And first I want to say this about this definition. There's probably many definitions, but this is a good one. The quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. That's integrity, moral uprightness. That's what Jesus is teaching us here. It's the state of being whole and undivided. Integrity is connected with the word integrated. When something is integrated circuit, everything is working together. You don't have one part sitting it out, because if you do, it doesn't work. Integrity, the state of being whole and undivided. And all that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount is deeply rooted in his own integrity. Rooted, that's what you'd write in, yeah? If you're writing, I sure hope you will. Takes a lot. Did I do it already? Gave you a freebie? Okay, got 3 freebies. Okay, good for you. Lucky you. All that Jesus teaches, think about it. Everything he's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, not just this segment, but throughout the whole sermon, is about integrity. And we'll talk a little more about what that means. And here's an example. He said it just in the last chapter. But let your yes be yes, and your no mean no. Don't waver and vacillate, and you said yes, but it's really a no. You just didn't know how to say it because you didn't want to disappoint. But you're not honest about it. Anything more than this, he says, is from the evil one. You don't want part of your integrated circuit to include the evil one, do you? No, he's going to make it go haywire. He's going to send you off course, and you're going to crash. Talking about integrity. So I want to give you some quotes from some well-known followers. We see this one from Jesus himself, and we're going to have a number of them in this segment of chapter 6, 1 through 13. But let's look at what some well-known followers of Jesus have said about integrity. It's not the final list, there's many, but C.S. Lewis has this to say about integrity. It's doing the right thing even when no one is looking. It's one thing to do the right thing when you know you have an audience, but if that audience isn't there, and sometimes you maybe have something devious in mind and you check to see if anyone's looking, or is that just me? I think we all have that tendency, and he captures it here saying, do the right thing even when no one is looking. Oh, here's a familiar face, Billy Graham. 1918 to 2018, so that's like 100 years, isn't it? That's a lot like 100. Integrity, what's he say? He says it means that if if our private life were suddenly exposed, we'd have no reason to be ashamed or embarrassed. And when I think about him, I think that is probably so true. There were no skeletons in the closet so far as a human can live the life. And he probably would never make that claim himself. But from the outside looking in, I believe we're looking at a man of integrity. He says this also. It means that our outward life is consistent with our inner convictions. The things you really believe are demonstrated out here. Just like gravity. We have an inner conviction that if I step off this ledge, I'm going to crash. So I don't do that intentionally. If I'm on a ladder, integrity. Hey, this is what St. Paul, or Paul the Apostle, says. He says our boasting is this, the testimony of our conscience. We can brag about what our conscience testifies to, but you can see it, that we have conducted ourselves in the world and more abundantly toward you in the purity and sincerity of God, and not in fleshly wisdom. And then he credits God for it, but in the grace of God. That's what makes that possible. He's not a braggart. He makes a point of saying, I got nothing to boast about except Jesus, except the resurrection, except what God has done. But he says, now if I was to boast, essentially it would have to be the testimony of my conscience. Integrity. Now we're going to get into the message. We're going to look at other things that Jesus has said. And here's my title. Integrity is doing the right thing. For what? The right reason. We can do the right thing, but we're not doing it for the right reason. We're doing it as a pleaser, or we're doing it as someone whose yes is not yes, and no is not no. Doing the right thing for the right reason. And hopefully you can find some things in here that will speak to you and help you with this common human problem. Jesus begins the sermon, this chapter breaks the sermon down, of course. Now imagine if Jesus does this whole sermon in one setting. There really wouldn't be much time for this kind of deeper drilling. There wouldn't be question and answer likely. Now, oftentimes the Bible is constructed in a certain way that captures and consolidates, so it doesn't really matter whether it was all at one time or not. It was definitely drinking from a fire hose if it was. But we break it down into chapter and verse, and so here he's continued, and where he ended at last is, where we ended chapter 5, he says, you therefore be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so he says, if we continue from there, be careful how you practice your righteousness. And he's going to list pious acts of hypocritical righteousness. So that's your right in there. He's going to list 3 pious acts of hypocritical righteousness from the public arena of religious practice. So it's things that happen in all kinds of religious circles that are these hypocritical. They can be hypocritical acts of righteousness. And this is a breakdown of what he just said. Be careful how you practice your righteousness. Almsgiving. It has to do with your giving. And in this particular area, and this was really important to the Jews and the Jewish mindset, was their almsgiving. That was over and above their offering and the prescribed temple tax and all of those other things. This was an extra thing. He says, but don't be a hypocrite about it. Prayer. He's going to break this down, all of these, he's going to break it down. Don't be a hypocrite about your prayer life. And don't be a hypocrite about fasting. Be careful how you practice your righteousness. So, Jesus' teaching applies to every pious practice, both then and now. So there may be some that he's not listing in here, but these are ones that were very common in that day and would be common in our day also. He warns against doing any act to be praised by others. Do the right thing for the right reason. That would be doing a righteous act for the wrong reason if you're doing it to be praised by others. He warns against that. He guarantees that those who ignore this warning will get what they want. They'll get their praise from people, but no more. That's as far as it's going to go. That's as deep as it's going to run. Third thing is he teaches us to perform our righteous acts secretly. That's all part of that thing about doing it to be praised by others. We do it not because it's going to bring us praise. I don't remember what we were talking about yesterday as we were driving home. Maybe I do, but I won't go into it. There are things you do, and you find out, I don't think those were appreciated just because of remarks that were made downstream and so forth. But then you just have to say, but what does that matter? That's not the important thing. And if I'm living for the accolades and the attaboys and the praise, then I never should have done what was a good thing otherwise. If I'm going to want to take it back and say, those creeps, I'll never do anything nice for them again. He assures that the Father who sees in secret will reward openly. I love that. God is going to reward openly. He's going to shout it from the rooftops. There's things that will be shouted from the rooftops that we never wanted anybody to hear. But this kind of thing will be rewarded openly. And so I'm thinking, don't look forward to that in this dimension. You will be disappointed. Sometimes it will happen, but then you better be very careful and on guard because you might just be being buttered up. Integrity, the quality of being honest. This is a definition. And having strong moral principles, moral uprightness, and it's the state of being whole and undivided. Did I give you this one already? Well, here's a refresher then. Do you want to be whole and undivided? Or, James talks about being like a wave tossed on the sea. When you ask for wisdom, trust that God is giving it to you, and then you need to proceed with that as you understand it. Otherwise, you are, you're unstable in all your ways. Like a wave tossed on the sea. The least little thing, you're over here, now you're over here. Now you're down here, now you're up there. So Jesus' sermon applies to every pious practice, both then and now. And I think we need to remind ourselves that the things he's saying to his audience then, our reason for reading it and embracing it is so that we can understand how we're to live then and now lives of integrity. How we're to live now these lives of integrity. And he's going to go into, first of all, integrity for the pleaser. Are there any pleasers in the room? I remember when we first met Eric and Carol, they came to our house to kind of welcome us into their church in Gilroy. And I remember as I was talking that Carol, who is very intuitive and insightful and perhaps even prophetic, noted that I was a pleaser. I was just from the things I said, I was trying to garner some praise, gain some ground, and she noticed, and of course it's because they've been around the block, they've seen it before. I've learned to recognize this. Integrity for the pleaser is to an audience of one, and Jesus cautions us to do our good works to please that audience of one. When you're worshiping, when you're praying, when you're doing anything, when you're giving, it's for number one. And that's not me. So he says, I'm going to repeat this. Well, it's kind of a repeat, but it's not. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen. I think he's captured that thought. But there's a little more. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father. You'll get this much, but no more, if you ignore this directive. Jesus teaches now integrity in giving. Remember, that was one of the first ones we looked at, almsgiving. Here, this is going to be, we'll elaborate a bit on this. Jesus teaches about integrity in giving. He cautions us to be whole and undivided with what and how we give. You have to kind of let that roll around in your mind a little bit. And so, with what you give, do you give your best? You know, in that song that we sang, "This is my offering," he says, "I give you my life. It's all I've got to give because you gave your life for me." Now, we might think, well, yeah, I got all this other stuff I can give. But giving your life? You know what? That's like the ultimate thing. That's like, send me where you want to send me. Have me do what you want me to do. I remember talking with Steve, your cousin Steve Johnson? Steve Johnson, yeah. And he said, when I pray, I don't ask God to help me. He says, I ask God to make me. A seasoned Christian. He says, hey, I don't want to have a maybe here, that it's dependent upon me mostly. God, make me, because I know the part that's dependent on me won't happen. He cautions us to be whole and undivided with what and how we give. Let's look at some more of that. So when you give to the needy, did you notice he doesn't say so if? He says so when you give to the needy. Do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Talk about for public display. Do not do it in the synagogue or in the church. You know, hey, I want to do this good thing, and I hope you all saw that. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. He's talking about the hypocrites. They're doing it for public display. Now, I wondered about this. Now, he's describing what's not integrity. And I wondered about this idea of blowing trumpets. Did they really announce their good deeds by having a little caravan? I couldn't find anything on that, but what I did find, I think was useful. You see this Pharisee, this wealthy man, throwing coins into the receptacle. It was actually a trumpet-shaped receptacle that was in the court of the women. See, the women could go that far. They could go to where they give and no further. But it was in the court of the women, and so here was this trumpet-shaped receptacle, and we see a bigger picture of a rendition of it there on the left, and someone putting an offering in it. And then we see is the widow, the widow's mite. She's not going to ring any bells or blow any trumpets with that. And interestingly, Jesus is watching where the money is being received or given at the temple or the synagogue. I think it's at the temple. And he notices this. He sees the wealthy man blowing his trumpet, ringing the bell. And then he sees this woman, and he says, she's given more than any of them who gave out of their abundance. She gave all she had to live on. That's a hard act to follow. Yeah? And she wasn't trying to draw any attention to it except for an audience of one. God, this is what I have. You've given it to me. I'm giving it back to you. And Matthew talks a lot about this, or the Gospels do in general. I'm taking this one from downstream. In Matthew 23:28, he says, so you too. Well, why don't we take a little ownership of that? So you too. Outwardly appear righteous to men, to people. And here's a definition of hypocrite. Hypocrisy is the state of pretending to have beliefs, opinions, virtues, feelings, qualities, or standards that one does not actually have. Hypocrisy involves the deception of others and is thus a lie. And the word comes from theater, where a mask would be worn to represent one expression, one emotion, one character, and another mask could be put on just as quickly. And that's why this picture captures that idea. He says then, but when, not but if, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That's one of those strange ones, isn't it? You know, they're both, if I'm integrated, they both know what's going on, so I don't think it's really so much about me, who my left hand is more, I don't know. How would you interpret it? Anyone got a bright insight on this? I think it's about integrity. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. If you're going to give, don't be second guessing it. Be wholeheartedly giving. I said this last week that I referenced how when we come to a stop sign and there's somebody standing there and they got a sign, or they're sitting or they're walking along the line and you're the first one at the light, it's awkward. But we're not to give because we feel this compulsion that we have to. We're to give because if and when, because it brings a sense of gladness. Are you raising your hand, Tom?
Well, yeah, just to share some insight on that, I think that what he's talking about is that it becomes a natural act, just like breathing and things. You're not aware of everything that's going on inside your body, right?
Yeah.
You may have studied it, but you're not thinking about it. And I think that's the whole thing, is that, you know, a person has an internal habit of giving,
Yeah.
and they're just going to do it automatically when the need arises. They're not going to be...
Yep, not going to have to spend a whole lot of time deliberating over it. And, you know, if you satisfy in your mind that I'm not going to give to every situation, but I'm going to give to someone when I sense the Spirit or what I see there calls me to do it. And to repeat what Tom was saying, since it wouldn't be heard, you're saying that one way to look at this is that when it becomes a natural act, just like our autonomous bodily functions, when it becomes your natural habit to give without a whole lot of having to make big decisions or vacillating, that perhaps is what this is meaning. So that your giving may be in secret. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. You know what? Ponder this. Take a little time to consider what it is that Jesus is saying. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. But he goes on to say, then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Give in secret. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. If your left hand has decided to give, let it be. I think this is a write-in for you. Man sees your actions, but God sees your motives. See, this is central to all of this. That we're talking about motives. Integrity shows what our integrity and our motives are integrated or not. I mean, if our motives are one thing, so let's take the pleaser who's doing something for praise and accolades. If that's the motive, there's a bit of integrity that's missing there. Now, the person, but it looks good. It seems good. But God is saying, you know what, work on that a little bit, because if I see it, and I can see the inside, and if that's in need of a little tune-up. Now he's going to talk about prayer. He talks about integrity in prayer. And then he's going to begin with how not to pray. This is how you shouldn't pray. He says, but when you pray, go in your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. That's how you should pray. So scratch that. I put that in the wrong place. But when you pray, now this is good. He starts with the positive. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then the Father, just like all the others. It's really the same formula for each of these. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And by this, it raises the question, does Jesus advocate private prayer only? That that's the only kind of prayer that has validity? I see heads shaking, and I think we know our Bible well enough, and we know what is effective Christian practice well enough to know that's not what he's saying. But he is talking about, but don't pray as a hypocrite. So this is what needs to be meted out here. No, he's not saying that the only place to pray is your private prayer. And when we get down to Matthew 6, 9 through 13, that is the disciples' prayer. We'll see that illustrated a little bit.
I have a comment on that about the inner room. The inner room is
Yeah.
inside of us.
Yeah?
That's how I think of it. Even if I'm in this room
Yeah.
with people, I'm praying from my heart.
Yeah.
The inner room of my own.
Yeah. Yes, and
So, of course, that's good, because integrity,
that's where it's got to start. There's a passage that says, judgment begins in the house of God. That's where the judge is looking and expecting to see what he's been teaching, that we've integrated those things. By this, Jesus does not advocate this. He says, and when you pray, now he's going to go on to another aspect, praying with integrity is more than blah, blah, blah. So you might be in a circle or whatever, and you're just praying because you got to say something. Or maybe and I catch myself doing this. The other person doesn't know what you're praying about, and so you kind of tell the little story over here. You stop praying in a way, and so I'm trying to at least be conscious of that and say, well, let me give you a little background here, and then we can pray together, and I won't be distorting what prayer is. When you pray, don't keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they'll be heard because there are many words. I remember listening to a guy pray. I didn't know the fella, and he went into all of this flowery speech about the names and the character of God, and I thought, all right already. All right already. I think you're trying to impress me with all you know. That's what it felt like. It was a distraction. And then I remember someone we knew, and more in the secular
realm than in the religious realm. This was
kind of first-time awareness, and I asked him to pray in our little setting, very small setting, and he was awkward. But I thought it was the most beautiful prayer I ever heard. It was just straightforward, unembellished, no nonsense, and a bit self-conscious. He didn't want to say, he wanted his yeses to be yes and his no's to be no. He didn't want to say anything else. And I still remember that and think, you know what? There's not one way that God is pleased with in our prayer. He says, don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you even ask.
So you would wonder, is there any point in praying?
If God already knows what I need? Jesus says, don't be like them, babbling away and carrying on and on and on. Your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. I think He wants us to be in that process, in that relationship where we're talking with Him. And when we have needs, He's aware of our needs. He wants to meet our legitimate needs, but sometimes they need to be sorted out a bit. And so He might just keep us on hold for a little while. The question again, by this, does Jesus advocate private prayer only? Now we're going to look here as we go into Matthew 6, 9 through 13 in an
Attempt to answer that question.
And I want to call it the disciples' prayer. It's a better term than the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father is all right, but it's not the prayer that Jesus is saying, okay, here's how I pray. Well, it's also not saying it isn't. But the disciples have asked Him, Lord, teach us to pray. And He says, well, this is how you should pray. And the important part of that is that this is the manner of prayer. And so when we listen to the Hillsong song, it said this prayer, but with a little different wording, with fresh wording. And you know,
Richard, I always take notice and
think of you when it comes around the circle, or when I hear you pray, it's our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. You don't do the whole prayer, but you start out in the manner that is prescribed here. This is about God. This is about glorifying God. It's about Him, not about what I'm asking. And so the priority is to glorify God's name. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Our Father. Here's the thing that says it's not just for private prayer. It's our Father. He's teaching them. He doesn't say, when you pray, go into your
closet and pray, my Father. No,
He's teaching them, you would say something like this. It's inclusive. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. It's about glorifying God. If you look back just at what I had you write in, it's the opening position is the priority of glorifying God when we pray. If you said nothing more, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, you'd be saying a lot. You'd be saying a whole lot. God, I'm thinking about your name. How wonderful. How wonderful you are. I'm experiencing
right now, this characteristic
of who you are. Your name declares it. Jehovah Jireh, you're the one who provides. My healer. My helper. Hallowed. So let's look at the word hallowed. And for in songs, I think for meter or for the syllables, it's broken down as hallowed. But hallowed is how I say it. It's holy, consecrated. The church stands on hallowed ground. When God told Moses to take off his sandals, you are on hallowed,
holy ground.
It's sacred. It's revered. God, your name is holy. Your name is consecrated. It's set apart, sacred. It is revered. To be holy, consecrated, sacred, and revered in my where I live. That's where I'm to be coming from. So here's more about the disciples' prayer. I gave you the priority. Let me give you the purpose. It's to express our deference to God's will. You know, that's the word that came into my mind, deference. But I had to check myself. You know, I might have the wrong idea of what a word means, and so I've checked myself on this, but I'm going to finish this up
A little bit. He says,
hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth. So the priority is to pray God's glory, hallowed be your name. The purpose is this. This is what we're praying for, what Jesus says to pray for. Just as everything in heaven goes as it should, under your authority in that sinless environment that you are in charge of, that you beckon us and invite us to, let your kingdom
come and your will be done here on earth,
just like it is in heaven. It's, Lord, I'm asking you to put the mirror image down here. Now, you're going to have to do some work on me. You can start here and do some work on me and in these areas of integrity, so that your will on earth is reflected in my life. Deference. Here's the definition of deference that I found. Humble, submission and respect. When you defer. When you defer, you're allowing someone else to decide or
choose something.
You're deferring to their wisdom. I had an excavator neighbor working with his excavator on a project yesterday, and it was all we knew was that this had to go over and up there. But we didn't have a clear plan, because when we lifted this big stairway out, who knew that back in the day I had poured 1.5 yards of concrete around it to anchor it. And so that's when we discovered that not only did we have this thing to maneuver, we had this massive load of concrete. He couldn't pick it up. We had to drag it like this.
All kinds of maneuvers to do that.
We didn't have a clear plan. And along the way, he'd say, well, what do you think about this? And I'd give him my thought, and I'd say, but what do you think? You're the expert. You know, I mean, you know more about it. I got ideas, and no doubt they will help, but you're the operator. You know what your machine will do. I was deferring to him. And we worked together really well. To defer to something is to agree to follow someone else's decision, tradition, etc. I would have gladly gone along with the way he proposed doing it, and I did. And sometimes things worked out the way we hoped, and sometimes they didn't. In this manner, that's what this prayer is about.
Pray in this manner.
Earlier when I talked about the Hillsong song and some other ways that we sing Our Father, the wording may be a little different. It isn't like you've got to pray these exact words every time for it to be the legitimate prayer that Jesus has prescribed. But the sequence, I think, is very important, and that's where it added to my own grasp when we pray. Let's start with the priority. It's to glorify God's name. It's not for me to hold out my hand and say, God, give me, give me, give me. I tend to say, Lord, and then I say my prayer. A friend of mine, when we meet, he says, well, Lord, and it's sort of like,
I think about it.
and I'm thinking, you know, I'm not sure we're even approaching this right. I'm not sure that our prayer is approaching God the way it comes easy and natural to us, but I'm not sure that we're doing it the right way. And so in this manner, now, after you have said those other things and approach God this way, now a disciple may reverently approach the throne of God to make sincere and submissive supplication. Now, that's not a word I use, supplication. But it's a really good and important word, because there's a distinction between supplication and prayer. Prayer is pretty broad, but
Supplication is very specific.
let's take a look at that. Did everybody get these two things, reverently and supplication? Everybody who's writing. I want to give you a piece from Hebrews that's going to help us with this. Let me go back and show you. A disciple may reverently approach the throne of God to make sincere and submissive supplication. And in Hebrews, it says exactly that. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. This is what it's promising and saying, hey, don't be afraid to
Approach God. We're going to be doing that in just
just a little bit here. If I keep you a little longer, it's because I wanted to do this whole prayer, the disciples' prayer, and it opens the door for communion, the Lord's table. So, prayer versus supplication. Let's look at a basic, simple definition. A request is always made in supplication. In this type of prayer, one asks for or desires something from God. And sometimes that's the only way we pray, is going to God and say, I want this, I want that, I don't want that. And we're thinking that He
is our slot machine.
or whatever it is, our bellhop. In prayer, there may be no request made, but only praise showered in God. So if you say, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, you've prayed. There's no supplication in that. You're not asking for anything. That's the prayer portion of the disciples' prayer, the first part. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then we go on to give us this day. Now we're supplicating. Here's a great example that comes to mind. And this is, I'm just taking this one passage. It's really worth reading, chapter 8. The king extended
The gold scepter toward Esther.
so she got up from a prone, bowing position, humble, reverent, and stood before the king to make her request. He was saying, come. She could approach the throne of grace, the throne of Artaxerxes or Xerxes, and he's saying, come. God extends his scepter, his gold scepter of authority and grace, and welcomes us to come. But she approached him right. She wasn't careless or casual and just bang on the door or just walk in. She approached him with reverence and respect and deferred to his will. Yes, come. She made reverent, sincere, and submissive supplication. Supplication, it's a humble request, prayer, petition, etc. It's the act of humbly begging for something, especially when pleading with God in prayer. Now, I don't think, when I read that word begging stands out to me. Begging? I don't like to think of myself as a beggar. But we are. We are. And I love the passage, or not the passage, but the saying that says, the good news is about one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That's the good news. Hey, I found some bread. It's way more than I need for myself. Come on. The act of humbly begging for something, especially when pleading with God in prayer. You gave me an aha look. You have been there. You've been saying, God, this is so important to me.
It just reminds me in the Sermon on the Mount, the poor in spirit, he's talking about us, the poor in spirit.
Talking about
The poor in spirit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They're very needy.
They recognize their condition, and they're approaching God right. They're not coming with pomp and trumpets and glory and all of the other stuff. Give us this day our daily bread. We're almost through this. There's the beginning of the supplication portion of it. Why do we say, give us this day our daily bread? Well, Jesus wants us to understand that it's the prescribed request as he gives it here is for one day. One day at a time. Not, God, fill my pantry up. Make sure my refrigerator and my freezer are full. We like that. But the truly
needy person is just saying, hey,
I really need a meal today. We'll deal with tomorrow when we get there, if I'm still alive. The prescribed request is for one day at a time with faith and dependence upon God to meet our needs. Jesus says at another place, do not worry about what you'll eat or drink, and it goes on and he explains, gives a comparison. And then we know about God's provision in Exodus in the desert of manna. The people were hungry and complaining. You know what? They weren't asking nicely. They were pissing and moaning. Complaining, grumbling, all the time.
No matter what good thing God
did for them. But God provided manna, and it was for that day only. If you read the account on it, if they took too much, it would have maggots in it. One person violated the command and took too much, and the next day all of his stuff was full of maggots. No longer dependent, no longer acting out of faith. Now he moves on to this other aspect, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. If you can't really, so it's a comparable. Forgive my debts,
just as I forgave
the debt of that other person. Now, it's like with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. If I don't forgive, or if I only give this much, God's saying, well, then you're only wanting that much from me. Think about that. And so Jesus says, think about that when you are praying. When you're asking God for things, remember who owes you something that you haven't forgiven. And now you're coming and you're asking and you're begging. And amongst these things, the most important of all is that your sins are forgiven. This is a prayer of supplication.
Well, here's what it's saying.
You are to forgive just as I have forgiven. You are to forgive just as I have forgiven you, just as we have been forgiven. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Some say the evil one. You know, I kind of like that because it personifies the reality that there are angelic forces, there are rulers and principalities in the heavenly realms that are opposed to God, the work of God and the people of God. There's an evil one. And sometimes we think
The evil one is that person over there, but we need to
recognize, no, there's an evil one and they're under the influence of that. We are. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the one that's harder for us to see. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Well, you know, there's a bit of a problem there if we think that God would lead us into temptation. And so my write-in is this. Just a reminder that you can't blame me, Jesus would be saying this, you can't blame me for your own lack of self-control. He led me into temptation. Or even the devil made me do it. You know what? Take some ownership. No, it's your lack of self-control.
Yeah.
Just a reminder that you can't blame me. It's a reminder. Lead us not into temptation. No, you don't tempt us. That's not about me. That's about you. And we can't tempt God. But we can work on our self-control. And the passage ends with this summary declaration. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. That's good news, huh? Forever. It's right there. And if you agree with that, then you say, amen. Amen. Well, Lord,
Be with us now as we go into communion.
as we come to the Lord's table, as we come, may we too approach with boldness to glorify you, just as you will. And Lord, may we find mercy and grace in our time of need, because really we're always needy. We're never conscious of the amount of mercy and grace you pour out on us. We take it for granted. But Lord, help us to be conscious of it more, and help us as we come forward this morning to recognize that we are approaching the throne of grace, and we can do this with boldness and confidence.
Believing and trusting you to be the good
God, you are. I'm going to uncover this, and the text will